Hello everybody and welcome to day 21 of 28 days to master level chess tactics. Today I'm going to start on blockade, which is the first out of 3 days that we're going to cover blockade because it is a very important tactical and strategical pattern that you should know. And the first thing you should know about blockade is that it commonly occurs as a kind of strategical device within a tactical combination. And that might sound complicated, but let's just start with this position. It's white to move, and you can pause the video now. All right, so what I mean by it's more of a strategical idea in a tactical combination is that as white to move, you can see that there's multiple threats of white. He has a check with the rook, he has a check with the queen, he has this knight that wants to jump in. Black has some activity with the queen here, but it looks like he maybe took a pawn or a piece. Maybe not a piece, at least a pawn. Or he took something, or he just moved his queen here. I am not sure exactly why. But the bishop also is threatening this pawn. But otherwise, white has a pretty strong attack against the king. So it's basically 2 rooks, a queen, and a knight against 2 rooks and the black king. So this should lend you to some kind of forcing combination. Now, this is actually a blockade tactic, but you could see that it starts with a queen sacrifice. So it actually starts with queen takes h7, king takes, and now you have rook check. The rook and the knight are covering the square. And then finally, you're able to bring in the blockade with the knight. So white has a double threat of checkmate right here. And if the rook moves, then it's check and checkmate right here. And black cannot deal with both of these threats. And so the game ended and black resigned in this position. Let's just play the variation. So if the rook moves, he needs to give his king a square to move. Then he checks. The king has to go here. He could even take that bishop, but why do that when you can just checkmate? Notice that the rook is protecting this knight on g6. And then, of course, if the rook moves anywhere to try to... Well, I guess that wouldn't be good either. You just checkmate. So basically, this rook does have to move, and then you get a checkmate on f8. Now, you see that from the beginning of this combination, it's not necessarily a blockade right from the get-go. It's more in concert with other ideas, namely using a blockade to prevent any escape squares of the king. Now, blockade as a strategical idea is more preventing a pawn from moving, namely getting a knight in front of it, usually, or a bishop, or even a rook, depending on the piece, and then you use that reduced activity of your opponent to win that pawn or piece. But in this particular situation, after the queen sack, white uses a blockade to reduce the movement of this pawn. And now that it's actually a death trap, because since this pawn can't move, it's blockaded by the knight. The knight also supports the mate on either h8 or f8. All right, moving on to position 2. All right, this position is white to move, and you can pause the video now. All right, from the get-go of this position, it's otherwise equal. I mean, the pawn structure is a little wacky for white, but it's not such a big consideration because he has such a huge and destructive kingside attack that's going to come down the pike for black. All right, so white essentially has this half-open f-file. He has these 2 minor pieces, a queen, and also this bishop, which is a long-range piece that's cutting into the f7 square. And because it's pinned, there's a blockade that's coming down for black. So let's see how that goes. So the blockade could come in either on the f6 or the h6 square. And that means that black, well, he couldn't move this pawn that's pinned anyway. But what white has to do is he has to find a way to break through on these 2 squares to get to the g7 square. So there's multiple moves here. There's knight check, there's bishop to f6, there's a check here, and there's even rook to f3, bringing in the rook. And so you'd have to look at all those variations. Now, in this position, rook to f3 actually works perfectly, just a simple plan of rook to f3 and rook to h3, and actually black can't stop it. But there's a much quicker acting way with bishop to f6. And the simple idea is that if the pawn takes, then the knight is already blockading, and the queen can just go to h6 and checkmate on g7, and the queen is forced to give up itself for the knight. Now, of course, if the queen takes, then you have to see this discovered check, and then the pawn takes, and then the rook takes the queen. And then you can just stack up the pressure on the f-file with the queen and the rook, and there's really nothing that black can do about that, and you've already won the queen, so it's easily winning. All right, so hopefully this was a good introduction for more complicated examples of blockade, rather than just putting a knight in front of a pawn and slowly winning it. This is more using blockade to aid in a kingside attack, and more using it to bring about other tactics, namely queen sacrifices and discovered checks. But other than that, we're going to get into a more complicated example tomorrow as well. So thanks for following along, and I'll see you in day 22. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time.